Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show is the third chapter in the incredible series from Wayne Harbison. As ever, please do let us know down below in the comments what you thought. Please do like and share, help build the channel and our community further. And of course, don't forget to hashtag TeamFEAR. Without further ado, let's get into tonight's story, entitled The Hunters Hunted, Ties of Blood and Shadow, a tale of the Witchkin. Let's get straight into that. Colorado, June 1978. The electric cart hummed softly as Buffett Wilson rode it along the maze of tunnels that made up the Colorado Containment Facility. They were nearly half a mile underground, and the facility itself spread out for over a mile in each direction in a honeycombed warren of white walls and tiled corridors. Each of these corridors was lit with a combination of fluorescent and ultraviolet bulbs. It was hard on the eyes, and Buffett thought it was ironic to need sunglasses this far underground. The facility had been usually quiet of late. He suspected that was due to a change in policy that shifted from capturing and studying the arcane to one of neutralizing them. It was just as well as far as Buffett was concerned. He'd been on his share of missions before he nearly lost his leg to a fate-bonded shark off the coast of Massachusetts. He had scars running from just above his knee all the way down to his ankle, where the creature's many rows of sharp teeth had flayed his leg into strips of flesh and skin. The only thing that had saved his leg, and possibly his life, was the efforts of an arcane agent on the mission. He'd lost his status as an active agent and had landed a nice cushy job here at the containment facility, making sure the arcane creatures held here didn't escape. The hours were good, the pay was more than enough, and he got to continue to pay into the agency's retirement fund, bettering his payout when he did finally retire. All he had to do was make sure all the lights were working and all the doors were locked. He knew far better than to try and peer through any of the doors, shuttered windows, or to obey anything he heard. Instead, he rode his cart for 8 hours a day and collected a paycheck every 2 weeks. It wasn't a bad living. He was nearly halfway down a tunnel that led to a single cell when a series of loud pops started echoing from a grey haze at the end of his vision. This corridor contained one of a few arcane who had been contained instead of destroyed of late. Brought in about a year ago in a chained coffin recovered from a mausoleum in South Alabama. It contained some kind of arcane creature that the agency was very interested in. It took several moments to realise that with the pops and the grey haze was approaching faster than his cart speed would indicate. Suddenly, the lights in front of him popped dark and showered the corridor with broken glass and tiny droplets of mercury. He shielded his eyes from the falling glass as the lights behind him continued to pop out. Then he saw her, standing there in the circle of light thrown by the headlamp on his cart. Some part of his mind identified the creature as a she, but there was no visible indication that it was. His mind suddenly went into mission mode as he tried to identify the arcane. She was somewhere between 4 and 5 feet tall. Her bony shoulders were stooped over, giving her a chest of a concave appearance, and the simple medical gown she was wearing hid everything to below her knees. Large black featureless eyes peered from behind slug-white skin, stretched taut over a hairless skull. Her arms were long and bony, and ended in hands whose fingers were too long. Long, sharp black claws stuck out from the end of the fingers. Her legs were thin, and the dead white skin clung to them. Its knees were knobbly, but her feet were long, wide, and clawed. Quickly, he threw the cart into reverse and hit the accelerator as the whining of his motor suddenly sounded deafening in the halls. The thing cocked its head to the side as if curious about him or the cart. She smiled, revealing several sharp teeth and canines that were far too long to be normal in her upper mouth. Looking back into the corridor, he knew there was no way the cart would outrun this thing. There was no way to make it to the general lockdown lever at the end of the corridor. The sudden knowledge that he was going to die tonight, and there was nothing he could do about it, filled his mind. He looked back at the thing, and it seemed to wink out of existence for just a second, only to be replaced by a girl, maybe no more than 14. She was pretty, with long champagne-coloured hair and bright blue eyes. She was wearing a simple dress that came to her shins. It had a high collar with a large bow that was tied to her throat. The sleeves were long and peaked at the shoulders. She wore dark hose and simple black shoes. She was the epitome of fashion for 80 years ago. Then the girl winked away and was replaced by the thing. It hissed at him.
Stay.
He fumbled for the emergency lockdown device at the end of the corridor, trapping him in there with the girl. No, the thing. His hands felt like they were numb. His thoughts became fuzzy. The girl winked back and said,
Stay, please. I'm scared. Where's Papa? Where's Mama?
His thoughts were suddenly filled with the image of a couple with the same colour of the hair as the girl, with the same eyes. Next to them was a boy of her age with the same colouring. He could almost feel the love and affection they had for the girl. Thoughts and memories of a Victorian-era family swam through his mind, and at one point he could feel the hot southern sun beat down on his skin and felt his body began to sweat under it. Shaking his head, he tried to force himself back to here, back to now. For just a moment, the corridor returned to his vision, and the thing bearing down on him. Suddenly, his arms were weights pulling him down into the deep, cool waters of oblivion. The snap of his neck barely registered on his mind as he was pulled down farther into the dark depths of the thing's lifeless eyes. Only the walls registered the soft sucking sounds that heralded Bufford's entrance into the realm of the dead. He was not going to need that retirement, after all. Thursday evening. We hit the decks running, and we spun those guns around. We found that mighty Bismarck, and we cut her down. Lance and his dad picked out the last few notes of the song he'd asked his dad to play for him since he was barely able to walk. Learning to play it himself was an accomplishment that Lance would treasure all of his life. You're picking up that geek box fast, Lance. It's clear you've been practicing, his dad told him as he looked over the fading light of the July evening. Thanks, the blonde boy replied. I don't know. It just seems that since I come home from the hospital last year, certain things have just clicked in my head. Lance wasn't about to tell him that it was because of his Witchkin enhancements awakening raw talent in him that he never experienced in his other life. His dad looked around before he slid back the caneback chair he was sitting in on their front deck and gestured out towards the fields that the plantation's foreman had begun to flood before planting the first rice crop. Leave your guitar here. Let's go for a walk. Okay, Lance said, surprised by the request. He let his mind reach out to his father's to gauge his mood, if not his thoughts. He could sense some trepidation, but no anger or disappointment. That was at least good as far as Lance was concerned. So far, he and his father had not butted heads even once over the past year, and that was a record he had never set in his old life. As they descended the 10-foot set of stairs that led up to the top deck of the cinder block house, Lance looked out over the lengthening shadows of the late summer light. It had originally been the farm manager's house when the plantation had been rebuilt by Sheridan McNaughton after the Civil War. However, the house had been completely demolished by the Hurricane Camilla back in '69 when the Dubois had rebuilt it. They'd rebuilt it out of cinder blocks resting on 10-foot concrete pilings. The doors were solid steel, as were the shutters. They had been the only thing that had kept the Gwyner at bay last year. For several moments, his eyes and ears strained at the night, picking out the forest sounds across the fields and by the river. What do you want to talk about? He asked his dad. For one thing, that look I just saw in your eyes, his dad said. What look? Lance asked. It's the same look I see sometimes in your Uncle Larry's face since he came back from Nam. You're searching the horizon for danger, his dad said simply. Lance shrugged and said, I'm sorry. I guess it's been a rough year. Well, no need to apologise, Lance. I just hate seeing my son's childhood destroyed by things beyond his control. He stopped a minute, pulled the pack of Winstons out of his shirt pocket, took one out, lit it, and put away his lighter. I'm not a stupid man, and I know you know that. I also know that what's been happening to you lately is absolutely crazy. I'm not crazy, he told his dad. I didn't say you were. I said what's been happening to you is crazy, and it's making my 14-year-old son develop habits you only see in soldiers, with battle fatigue. Lance just nodded at his father, continued to gather his thoughts. I had a long talk with Peter, Paul, and Tom. They tell me that you saved their lives, that you made it your personal responsibility to get them out of there safe and alive. Well, we both know that it didn't work out, Lance said bitterly. One girl died, his dad said. Yes, that's a tragedy, but out of 11 kids, you got 10 of them out of that forest alive. He stopped and put an arm on Lance's shoulder. You can't save the world, Lance. No matter how much you try, you can't always save everyone. And that's what put you in hospital in the first place. You need to fix things you had no control over. Lance nodded and fought back tears as the image in his mind of Donna Howard lying on the gravel, her hands crossed over her abdomen and her face pale and void of any life. I had to try. If I'd just done things differently, maybe she wouldn't have died. What could you have done differently? According to your teammates, you shot the man who was shooting at you and then managed to shoot that thing that attacked you. They told me that Donna took her hit while you were bouncing down the road from it, slinging you away from it. Then you got up and tackled it from behind. I don't see what you could have done differently. I knew something was wrong when we stopped. Something about the light on the road was setting off warning bells in my head, but I ignored them, thinking I was just being paranoid, Lance said quietly. I'll say it again, Lance. You can't fix the world. You're only 14. There are going to be things that you will have no control over. Part of becoming an adult is learning to let go of what you can't fix. Otherwise, you're pissing into a hurricane. It doesn't solve anything. And you get soaked trying. Lance nodded and said, I understand. He tapped his head and said, up here. But in my gut it feels wrong. Well, you need to work on that. I'm not saying don't trust your gut, but don't beat yourself up for being wrong sometimes. We all are. Even you? Lance asked, trying to tease his father. Well, I married your mother, didn't I? His dad said, dead seriously. And that's something else you don't need to try and fix. Your mother and my fights are between us. You don't cause them, and you can't stop them. Yes, sir, Lance said. That much he understood. Over the last year, he'd learned to ride out the storm of his parents' ongoing post-divorce spats and not try and make peace between the two. They stopped at the edge of the yard that his family used for their bi-weekly pickings, where they gathered with friends and family, picked out old country and gospel songs, grilled out and relaxed. Now this part, I'm not sure I will like the answer to, but I have to know. We've got a family to take care of here. What part? Lance asked. I saw that creature you killed in the fields here. That was no bear. The one that your teammates told me about wasn't a bear or a mountain lion either. They said the one here came after you because of a curse. You want to explain that to me? I don't know anything about a curse. Would you believe me if I said I made it up to keep them from worrying? You're going to lie to me? His dad asked seriously. If you tell me that's the truth, I'll believe it. There was something in his voice that Lance knew was there to give him an out, and to let him walk away with his secrets intact, but at the cost of his integrity. Lance took a deep breath and shook his head. No, sir. I'm not going to lie to you, but some of it is hard to explain. Some of it I can't explain. Can't or won't. Can't, Lance said. I still don't understand it all myself, but you know how Papa used to warn us all not to go out at night because of the Gwyner, and that it would get us? Yeah. Never could get him to tell me what a Gwyner was. I think that thing I killed was a Gwyner, and from what I've researched, it's been haunting our family for over 100 years. And the thing in the woods? There were two things. The first was like the Gwyner. The second, I have no idea what it was. It was big, mean, and dangerous. His father took a deep breath and said, Lance, since you came to live with us last year, you've done everything I've asked of you, sometimes before I ask it. Your grades have gone through the roof. You watch after your little brother, even going so far as to chase one of those things into an old mausoleum to get him back. You've become the star quarterback on your team, even though You've never shown an interest in sports before. And you've also been showing skills and interests you've never shown before. It's starting to scare me. I think it's the curse, Lance tried to explain. It changes you. The more it and I tangled, the more I changed. Changed? You said it yourself. I've got skills and interests that I didn't show before. It made me stronger, faster, harder to hurt and more alert. That's why those men in black suits showed up. There are other people like me out in the world, and the government would rather that the information not get out into the general public. They came in and cleaned up the messes, like the one here and the one in Kentucky. So are these things going to keep happening to you? Lance shook his head and said, I honestly don't know. Being aware of a possibility may make it more likely to occur. But when it does, I can't stand by and let people get hurt. That's not the way you raise me. His dad frowned at him for several moments, then taking a long drag of his cigarette, he blew the smoke upward and then said, What do you mean stronger, faster, and harder to hurt? Just that, Lance told him. He didn't want to get into a litany of the changes that had come over him during the past year, nor exactly how much Boone Dubois had helped him learn to use them. For now, he tried to keep it into the basics. I don't like to talk about it because if other people found out, then there would be questions I can't explain. I hit the Gwyner with enough force to break its legs. I got bounced off a water oak branch 15 feet in the air and landed flat on my back 30 feet away. All it did was knock the wind out of me. It should have broken my bones. He sighed. Like I said, I'm faster, I'm harder to hurt, and I'm stronger. Is that why you went out for football? His dad asked. You want to use those skills to make a name for yourself? Maybe play professional ball? Lance chuckled and said, No, football is a means to an end, not the end itself. I'm trying to put the kind of things on my resume that would get me an appointment to Annapolis. Playing sports is one of the things they look for. For long moments his dad stood there in the fading light of a hot July evening and thought about what Lance had said. Finally, he took the last drag from his cigarette and flicked it onto the fire pit. Exhaling, he said. I didn't know you wanted to go into the Navy. Lance smiled and replied, Yeah, it's a goal I've set for myself, and let's face it, even using my enhancements playing for the Navy wouldn't necessarily get me noticed by the NFL. Those guys aren't trying to get drafted. They go into the fleet when they graduate. Tell that to Roger Staubach, his dad told him. Staubach wanted to go to the NFL. I don't. Like I said, sports are a way of getting where I want to go, not the destination. Boy, sometimes you say the most peculiar things. Sorry, Lance apologized. No, I don't mean that it's a bad thing. It's just that you seem more squared away, more mature than 14. Here I am expecting to have a talk with you about not going out and knocking up some girl, and find out that you've been having plans laid out for the next 15 years or so. He shook his head. I know grown men who have never got that kind of drive. Lance just shrugged and said, It keeps me from getting bored. After this last year, I'd say you've been too busy to get bored. Lance nodded and told his dad, And I don't think I'm going to get a chance in the future, and that worries me. How? Taking a deep breath, Lance plunged in. Because I'm starting to develop a theory about all this stuff happening. People like me only exist in the cracks of reality. It's the only way we can exist, and that tends to bunch us up together. It sort of makes us a beacon to one another. How? Taking a deep breath, Lance plunged in. Because I'm starting to develop a theory about all of this stuff happening. People like me only exist in the cracks of reality. It's the only way we can exist, and that tends to bunch us up all together. It sort of makes us a beacon to one another. When I'm facing off with one of these things, I can get a feel for them. They give off this vibe that tells me they aren't normal, and that I should be wary. I suspect they can do the same with me. What's that supposed to mean? I think that's what's been happening. It's going to continue to happen. That my very existence rings the dinner bell for them. That scares me. It scares me too, boy. But it also sounds like good sense to me. But I'm afraid of putting you, Dale or Lucy in danger. Are you telling me you want to go back and live with your mother? There was a sense of dread in his father's voice. Lance quickly shook his head and said empathetically, "No, that would just put her and Roy and my other brothers and sisters in just as much danger." He stopped and thought about it and said, "I just thought that you might, should know." "Why?" his dad asked suspiciously. "In case you wanted to send me away," Lance finally said. His father's face contorted into visible shock. He shook his head and said, "Boy, I ought to beat your ass for thinking like that. Hell no! I don't want to send you away. Even with that Gwyner and what happened in Kentucky, there is nothing that could make me send you away. Put that kind of thinking out of your head, now." "Yes, sir," Lance told his dad. "Look, we'll deal with whatever these things are when they come along. You don't have to face them alone. I'll talk to Lucy tonight, but I think we better keep it away from Dale. You know how he likes to talk." "Dale had figured it out before you guys. He's known all along and won't talk about it to anyone. I think the Gwyner put the fear of God in him when he took Dale that night." "Let's hope so," his dad said, putting an arm around Lance's shoulder and guiding him back towards the house. "Now, tell me more about this plan of yours to get into Annapolis." Unseen by neither conversationalist, black, featureless eyes peered from the darkness beyond. Those eyes were very interested in the conversation the father and son had just shared. It explained so much. The owner had much to think about later, after it had fed and returned to its native soil. Friday night. Working summer Saturday nights at the skating rink was an exercise in endurance, alertness, and most especially patience, all of which Dawn found herself in short supply of at closing time. This evening had been especially rowdy. She didn't know why, but on some nights it was harder to keep the kids out of trouble than others. They'd broken up a fight in the conversation pit and chased at least half a dozen young couples from the hall leading to the storage room. 2 of the fighters had received a 2-week suspension from the rink, and one got a week. It was his first offence. The couples had been given a warning and sent back to face the sniggers of their friends. As for Dawn, she spent half her night keeping a popcorn machine that had seen far better days from either burning up or electrocuting one of the workers. On top of that, the CO2 tanks had to be changed out at least 3 times. Hot summer nights meant thirsty skaters, which meant lots of coke. And there had been the strange girl that she kept seeing lurking in the shadows. She dressed like something from the last century, and the hungry look in her eyes gave Dawn the creeps. She reported it to Jim, the owner, but any time he went to look for her, she disappeared. She was nearly exhausted by the time Jim had made sure the last kid had a ride home and locked the front doors. All she had left to do was get the mop from the storage room and mop the redstone tile of the kitchen area, and she was free to leave. She was supposed to meet her best friend, Tanya, up in Gulf City later this evening for the midnight showing of a Rocky Horror Picture Show, but she was seriously considering bailing on her. She was simply dog-tired, and from what she had heard about the cult movie, it wasn't the kind of film where she could likely fall asleep in the theatre. She was halfway down the hall to the storage room when a twin incandescent lights on the ceiling of the corridor suddenly burst. It plunged the hallway into a deep shadow that was only partially relieved by the red emergency exit light back in the direction from which she had came. Turning to look back, she called, "Jim? We got 2 lights out in the back hall." Hearing no answer, she called out again, "Jim, we got lights out in the back hall." Still getting no answer. She turned and headed back toward the kitchen. She was standing under the small circle of light cast by the exit sign when she heard the door to the storeroom open and close quickly. She felt a cold shiver run through her body as she headed towards the office to get a flashlight, finding the door closed and locked. Not unusual for when Jim had to count the day's receipts. There was no answer. "Jim?" She knocked again and called again. "Jim?" Still getting no answer. She went to the skate storage and got the flashlight that was used to find missing skates and shoes that missed the bins. Finding it under the counter, she made a mental note to put it back, or Kate, Jim's wife, would throw a hissy fit when she couldn't find it. The corridor was suddenly cold, and she wondered if someone had set the thermostat too low again. Following the beam of yellow light to the end of the corridor where the door to the storage looked like it was standing open, She wondered if this was someone's idea of a prank. If it was, she wasn't going to clean up the mess in the hall. They broke the lights, and they could clean them up. Pushing the door open, she reached in and flicked the light up. The 100-watt incandescent bulb flared to life, its light tearing back the shadows of gloom to reveal something hunched over on the far wall, just in front of the electrical panel. For a long moment, her mind refused to register the sight that she was seeing. It seemed to flicker between the girl she'd seen earlier and something white, skeletal, and horrifying. Bent over Jim. His head lay in an impossible angle, and Dawn could see where his throat was ripped open, and the thing, or the girl, had her face buried in it. Gasping at the sight, she stepped back in shock. The thing suddenly looked up at her, and Dawn could see its black lips smeared with blood. Long rivulets of crimson ran down its chin. She hissed at Dawn, just before disappearing from her sight to be replaced by the blonde girl in an old-fashioned dress. Dawn recoiled in horror, and the girl blinked away to reveal the thing again. Turning on her heels, Dawn sprinted down the hall with everything she had. She knew the emergency exit would give way if she hit it hard, and Dawn was more than scared enough to hit that hard. She slid to the stop in front of the door, turned hard, and threw herself at it. An impossibly long bony arm with clawed hands that spread out like a rake grabbed her by the shoulder and yanked her back down the hall with enough force to send her sliding on her butt toward the creature. The sheer power and strength in that grip was mind-boggling, but Dawn fought against it with her own strength, born of fear and desperation. Somehow, she managed to twist free and scrambled down the corridor on her hands and knees through the broken glass, desperate to reach the safety of the door. She was halfway there when her mind registered razor-sharp claws sinking deep into her back and shoulders. Irresistible strength reeled her back down the hall. Rolling over to try and pull the hooked claws from her flesh, she could see the thing's arm stretching 10 feet down the hall to pull her toward what was now a cat-like mass of fur and fangs. Opening its mouth impossibly wide, Dawn was yanked backwards towards the horrible teeth-filled maw. She screamed once as those jaws and teeth closed around the back of her neck in a bone-breaking vice. She heard the bone snap at the base of her head, and then she felt nothing else. The thing had left a far worse mess than broken glass in the hall, but Dawn would not be the one to clean it up. Still Friday night. It was well past 3 in the morning as Lance slipped between the covers. It had been a long but very enjoyable day. He and his dad had finished taking down a tree for a man on the other side of Gulf City in the Blakely area. It had been a challenging job to take down a water oak that stretched over both the man's house and the Tensor River. The pay had been good though. Lance had an extra $500 to put back. Well, $400. He had taken out $100 and divided it up to have some walking around money for the summer. After getting home from the job, they'd gotten cleaned up, and several of their friends and family joined them for a picking out by the fire pit. There had been burgers and dogs, chips, cokes, and of course, music. Lance was getting better with his guitar and was able to follow his dad's lead on how to pick out about half the songs, and he was able to at least strum the rhythm of the songs he didn't know. It was the first time he'd sat in with the musicians for all the picking, instead of back and forth between looking after the younger kids and singing when he could. As he settled into his bed, he tried to clear his mind, tried to reach that near trance state that made it easier to slide off into sleep. It was something he'd been working on with Boone before the Dubois had been called out of the country. Even Angelique had gone, which, considering her undead state, was not an easy task. That told Lance that it was something important. Slowly, the tension and the fatigue drained from his body, and his mind and he slipped into a deep REM sleep. The dream began as a pleasant walk along the banks of the Perdido River. He was walking with another boy about his age, dressed in an off-white linen suit with dark pinstripes. The suit looked old-fashioned. His hair was the colour of champagne, and his eyes as blue as Lance's own. It was a warm, early autumn evening, and he could hear the cicadas singing along the tree-line path as he slowly came to realise that this was not him walking with a boy, but a young woman of about the same age. "We shouldn't go too far," the boy said. "Mother will be calling us to supper soon." Just a little farther, or fair." He heard the girl's voice, high and melodic. She inhaled deeply, and Lance recognised the rich timbre of her early fall air on the Gulf. We also recognised that the girl's senses were as enhanced as his own. "We've been stuck in the house for days now, and I would like some fresh air." The boy seemed to consider what she was asking, and then nodded. "Maybe just a little farther. I would like to see the spot Uncle Theodore mentioned about fishing." The girl smiled, and Lance knew that she counted that as a victory over her twin brother as they continued to stroll down the well-maintained road that eventually led north out of Bontravel. Lance got the impression that the girl was accustomed to getting what she wanted. She was excited about something, but Lance could not fathom what it was. But he knew it was something important, at least to her. As the light continued to fade, the pair was walking close to the riverbank, when suddenly something huge and dark exploded from the water, and with a single blow it sent her brother flying backwards into a nearby tree. He bounced from there and down the road like a doll until finally skidding to a stop, balanced on 2 feet and 1 hand. She watched in fascination as her brother began to shift, tearing and ripping his clothes. White fur began to cover his body and face as he exploded out of his clothing, taking the form of a giant bipedal cat, its tail lashing back and forth angrily. Opal found herself fascinated by her brother's other form, a witchery that she had yet to express. So mesmerised by the action around her, Opal failed to follow the creature that had knocked him towel over tea kettle until she felt herself caught up in its massive grip and lifted high over its head. All she could see of it was a blur of black fur, amber eyes, and old yellow teeth. The cat screamed at it with a yowl that was half cry and half roar, and a challenge, just before it slammed into the hell thing that had her in its huge claws. She was spun out of its grip and bounced along the embankment until she came to a stop, stunned and half in the water. Shaking her head in anger, she looked down at the new dress her mother had bought her just last week and began to share in the rage her brother was currently unleashing on their attacker. Pulling her skirt to the side, she began to march up and out of the river, where she encountered an ancient old man offering his hand. "Come, child, we must be away from here," he said with a smile that revealed a mouthful of yellowed malformed teeth. Taking his offered hand to pull her up the rest of the embankment, she told him, "I must get to Mother and Father." She looked back to see where the white cat and the giant man-like dog were battling each other in a flurry of claws and bites. The girl may have not recognised her attacker, but Lance did. It was the Gwyner that he'd fought himself. The two beasts were kicking up turf and gravel as they strained against each other, seeking purchase of claw and fang. "They will know." Turning back to the man, she never saw the blow that knocked her unconscious. Lance had no idea how long his dream self or the girl was unconscious. He had no idea how long he'd dozed for before the dream reasserted itself in his mind. The girl was lying spread eagle on her back, her wrists and ankles bound in some kind of metal manacles. She was nude and exposed, but still fought like a cat to pull free, until a bolt of fire and force shot through her body that left her dazed and weak. "That will be enough of that, I think." The old man's voice came from above her head. Never passing into her field of vision, the voice continued, "I must admit that Merlin Holmwood did good work on this building. It took little labour to bring it back to functioning. Ironic, isn't it, Opal? The room that you saw your father express his therianthrope witcheries is where you will undergo even more radical shifts." "Where am I? Who are you? Where is Ophir?" she demanded. "When my father finds out about this, he'll kill you." The laugh that followed sent chills down the naked girl's spine. "He already did that once, and I didn't stay that way. Now, it's my turn." He stepped forward so she could see his form. He was short, nearly emaciated, and his skin was a leathery patchwork of jaundiced flesh. Long white hair was clipped to the nape of his neck in the fashion of the last century. His teeth were yellowed and his eyes glowed with such an intense red light that she could make out a few features about them. Long, delicate fingers with thick black claw-like fingernails held a large silver chalice in one hand, and a black obsidian blade in the other.
As for where you are, you are deep in the swamps of Bon Secure, at the laboratory where Merlin Holmwood tried to cut from your father his therianthropy. I, of course, am Oliver Westhall, 3rd Earl of Cathara. Of course, the title is now extinct since your father managed to kill me just before you were conceived. So, you may call me Lord Westhall.
He smiled evilly and added,
Of course, once this night is over, you will call me Master.
I will do no such thing, Opal fought the manacles.
Now,
he said soothingly.
Must I employ Professor Holmwood's most excellent batteries again?
He set the blade down next to her and stroked her hair like some beloved pet.
What is that for?
She demanded, eyeing the blade of black glass.
No need to worry, child. This blade will not part your skin. That would ruin the witchery.
What witchery? She demanded.
You will see, child,
he said, placing the silver chalice on the table to the side.
I have filled this vessel with the certain ingredients I need to punish your father. Some of them are quite foul, and just the act of gathering them are soul-shattering sins.
He shook his head again and smiled, saying,
But then again, my soul was shattered centuries ago when I was the power behind first Cromwell, then the monarchs that followed. It wasn't until Dubois and the MacNaughtons interfered did I know defeat. It wasn't until your father that I knew death. Now you will be his punishment.
My father will find you first, she screamed at him, defiantly. The old man simply chuckled and picked up the blade. Holding his own wrist over the chalice, he sliced deep into it. Opal watched in horror as black ichor, not red blood, spilled out over the blade and into the silver cup beneath it. For long moments, the ichor covered the blade like a black cloth that was sliced into ribbons by the blade before flowing into the chalice. Deeming it full enough, Westall turned his wrist over and licked a long cut in it, and then turned it where she could see. Like fabric pulled together by an unseen seamstress, the edges of the cut closed in front of her eyes.
See?
Fear and revulsion rose up in the girl's mind, and Lance could almost feel her wrists straining against the metal of the manacles. He could feel the metal start to warp from the strength with which the desperation and fear blessed the girl.
Father!
The girl screamed into the night. Lance could not hear Westhall's reply over the screams of pain that followed as more and more electricity poured into the girl's body. Deep inside her, the fear and desperation began to work its own change in her body. He could feel as bones realigned to themselves as her centre of mass changed, and suddenly the current surged stronger and her body shook uncontrollably until she lost consciousness. Again, Lance had no idea how long he was back in his own mind. He did not dream of himself, nor at all until he once again awoke as the girl, Opal. She was still bound to the table, but her body was racked in a new pain, and a foul taste filled her mouth. This pain came from deep inside her. He could feel it warping not only her body, but her mind and soul as well. It was unlike any shift he'd ever felt himself. It was a total body transformation, not the small but significant changes that Boone had taught him. His skin itched all over. His muscles began to spasm as the colour drained from the world in her bones, and the muscles stretched into a new form. A mad, tittering giggle came from her side, and she turned to see the form of Westhall standing there, his face lost in some madness only his mind knew. Lance felt the girl's mind begin to slip away into a madness of its own. Rage, jealousy, and hatred dominated her emotions. And there was another one there too. Devotion. A slavish devotion to the man in front of her. One word dominated her mind. Master. Slowly, sanity poured back into Westhall as he released her from her shackles.
Come, my dear. It's time for us to go to work. It's time for you to kill your father, your mother, and your brother.
The part of the girl that was Lance noted that the question as to her brother's fate was answered. He yet lived, for now. Again, the dream released Lance, as if the dreamer had no memory of what followed, and for a short period he knew peace and he slept, dreamless. Lance had no idea how much time had passed, either between dreams or between the last memory and the next. He was again the girl. No, not a girl. She was now a monster, and he was along for the ride inside its head. An awareness returned to the dream, and he found himself at night sitting on the outside of Bon Travail. A full moon was overhead, and the glow of the lights from the great house was somehow different. It was softer, less harsh, and there was both a flicker and a warmth to it that reminded him of the Coleman lantern the Howard kids had carried with them. Opal approached the house, but Lance could not ascertain as to how. It seemed like one moment they were 100 yards away, and then suddenly, the next, they were half that distance. There was another blink in reality, and they were suddenly even closer. After just a few moments, they were under the eaves of the great house. Another blink, and they were on the roof, outside of Orphea's room, peering in. Lance noted that the girl cast no reflection in the old glass of the window. Inside he saw where their other twin was resting quietly in his room. One of his arms was bandaged and in a splint, and there were claw marks across his face. His head was wrapped in another bandage, and despite the warm autumn night, there were quilts on the bed. Across from the bed, a roaring fire was burning in the fireplace, and Lance felt the girl wince at its flames. Next to the fire sat a tall, red-headed man in his late 40s. He was dressed in a butler's livery, and he was reading a small blue book. The girl's mind produced a name: Donovan. The girl winked again, and they were in the room. Donovan, seeing them, scrambled to his feet as he swept a Colt SSA Peacemaker from inside his coat. He got off a single shot. Lance could feel the round rip through the girl's body, but the girl ignored the pain as she backhanded him across the room and into the wall. He hit his head first and hard before sliding to the floor. She hissed at him. "My first kill for the master will not be a servant, no matter how loyal nor how well regarded." Turning to her brother, who lay helpless in bed, Lance could feel her turn over the idea of killing him. And finally, she shook her head and said, "Not an invalid. My first kill must be worth something." In flashes, the girl winked in and out. From room to room she searched the house, but could find nobody there, not even the servants. Realization dawned on the girl's mind as it became apparent. Mother and father must be out in the night searching for me. How sweet. But there was no sweetness in the girl's thoughts. With the rising of that knowledge in her mind, she swept them out into the night, seemingly unaware of Lance's ride with her, and for hours they hunted at night, looking for her father or mother. There were tantalizing tendrils of scent that sent the girl scouring the forest and swamp, blinking from one place to another. Lance began to realize that whatever Westhall had done to her head had shattered not only her soul, but her mind as well. She could not stay focused on the scent long enough to follow it properly. The sky was turning purple in the east when they finally caught up with her mother at the edge of the property. The pretty blonde woman was buckling on her boots at the edge of the swamp. She looked tired, worried, and nigh exhausted. The girl studied her from a distance for several moments as cruel thoughts raced through her mind. In a blink, they were on top of the woman with fingers that had become elongated and rake-like with sharp nails. The woman never stood a chance. The first blow opened her mother's throat, spilling her blood out onto the moist Alabama soil. The second blow became entangled in the back of her mother's hair, and as the girl drew back the strike, she twisted her mother's head sideways hard, and it was rewarded with an audible crack as the woman's neck was snapped. Then, to Lance's horror, Opal's face dashed into the open wound at her mother's throat and began to drink deeply of the blood that flowed from the wound. The deed was so heinous that Lance was once again flung from the girl's mind, and he woke and sat straight up in bed, his body covered in a slick sheen of sweat. He stumbled to his feet and dashed out of his bedroom door to the toilet between his and Dale's bedroom. Barely making it in time, he threw up a last remnants of the burgers and dogs he'd eaten earlier. Retching was how his dad found him half an hour later, hugging the toilet and sweating profusely in his white briefs. "Lancelot, what's wrong?" Lance shook his head at the thought of the dream. He knew the dream was real. His mind had synced with another, and it was a terrible creature of the night, even more horrible than the Gwyner. I guess I had one too many hot dogs, Lance lied. His dad stared at him for a moment. Are you sure about that? He asked, clearly not believing him but willing to give him that benefit of doubt. Just between the food and a bad dream. I lost my dinner. You don't sweat like that from a dream, his dad told him. Reaching down, he helped Lance to his feet and said, you're burning up. He guided him towards the tub and shower, and he helped Lance into it and turned on the water. The cold water was bracing, but Lance was too drained to notice. He just stood there shivering until his dad finally got him out of the shower and felt his skin. Fever is down. I'm going to put you to bed, and tomorrow, if you're still feeling bad, we're going to go to the hospital. All Lance could do was nod as he slid under the covers. It didn't take him long to fall asleep, but the sleep was anything but restful. Before long, he'd slipped back into the fevered dream of the girl named Opal. This time, she was bound once again in chains of purest silver as she fought the implacable force of her father's strength. Lance could feel the mind of the girl shriek in protest of what was happening. No matter what you have done, I cannot bring myself to kill you, Opal. I can't kill my own flesh and blood, but I can't release you into the world. No, father, the girl shrieked. Don't, I'll be good, she pleaded. Please, no. Her father lay her, chains and all, into a coffin made of rich, dark mock iron. Please, no, father, no. Lance could see the man's heart breaking at what he was doing. This was the hardest thing that this man had ever done. The tears rolled down his smooth face as the lid came down over the coffin. The thing that had once been Opal began to swear with such sulphurous blasphemy no girl of that age should know, but somehow she did. Lance could sense those curses with some balm to the man's conviction. His daughter would not know such words. This was Westhall's doing, not his daughter's. As the latch clicked on the coffin, the thing began to laugh. It was a wicked and evil sound that sent Lance's own body into shivers of fear. Not long afterward, the laughing ended as the last chain and lock were laid around the coffin. Then came the sound of the thick oaken door of the mausoleum being opened, and then closed and locked, and finally now shut. As the darkness and silence closed in on the coffin, Lance felt the thing go to sleep, and with that, it released Lance from its memory. As the sweet oblivion of dreamless sleep took him, Lance did not notice his father settled his desk with a book. Neither noticed the slug-white face that grinned maliciously through the window. As it drew away, it thought to itself, "This is the usurper. This weak-willed thing was what Ophir's line had produced to stand at the door of Bontraval. It lived in this house on stilts, not the main house. It was truly pitiful and unworthy." Slowly, it pulled back its dream tendrils of shadows and blood and returned to the mausoleum where it had slept for nearly a century. Tomorrow night, it would destroy the usurper and take its rightful place among the McNaughtons. Saturday morning. Lucy McKnight came down the hall to where the boys' rooms were. She peeked in on her son, Dale. She found the boy lying on his stomach, his covers kicked off and one hand hanging on the floor. She noted that Brandy, the boy's pit bull, was not there in her usual spot at the foot of his bed. She vaguely remembered the dog coming into the bedroom and waking her and Kendall after her husband got up. She went back to sleep, expecting him to return later, but he never did. Looking into Lance's room, she found her stepson lying under a quilt as if he was chilled. Brandy was laying on the floor beside the bed, and Kendall was asleep across the room at the boy's desk. An ashtray with half a dozen butts in it sat on the desk behind him. In his hand was a copy of that book he and his brother, Larry, were reading. Interview with a Werewolf, or something like that. Lucy didn't care for creepy stories, so she wasn't bothering keeping up with it. Dark shadows had been more her speed when it was on. Going over to check her stepson, she found that his temperature was normal, but he was looking a little pale. She glanced over at the book her husband was reading, and for just a second her mind entertained an idea, an impossible idea, before she gently shook him awake. "Lance, honey." The boy bolted upright and grabbed her hands, both in a frighteningly strong grip. "Please, no! Father! No!" His voice sounded way too high, and not like her stepson at all. She'd never seen her stepson like this, scared. Whatever he'd been dreaming was intense, and she briefly wondered if it had been something to do with what happened a few months ago in Kentucky. Kendall nearly fell out of his seat when Lance yelled, sweeping an ashtray off the desk as he came suddenly awake. The sound of the thick glass ashtray shattering against the concrete floor snapped Lance out of whatever he was dreaming, and for just a moment her stepson's face reflected a much older man's visage, and as quickly as it was there, it was gone, and he was letting go of her wrists. "What? You were dreaming," she said softly. "It was some nightmare." Lance shook his head and looked toward the window at the daylight streaming through. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't feel well last night." "Didn't feel well?" his dad asked with a chuckle. "You puked like a drunk prom queen. If I didn't know better, I'd have sworn you'd gotten into a beer last night." Lance shook his head and said, "I made my point with that. No need to repeat it." "What were you dreaming about?" Lucy asked him. Lance shook his head and said, "I think I was being buried alive." Lucy shuddered at the thought. "That would make me scream too," she agreed. Lance just nodded as Dale came padding into the room, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What's all this racket about?" Brandy got up from the floor and licked his hands. "Your brother was sick last night," Kendall said. "Why don't you let Brandy outside and the rest of us can get out of here and let Lance get dressed?" Without even thinking, the boy nodded and turned away, scratching his butt with one hand and heading towards the front door with a dog in tow. Lucy couldn't help but smile. Dale nearly worshipped the ground Lance walked on, but he was never very bright in the morning. He was definitely a slow riser that didn't really get going until he'd been up for a while. As Dale disappeared down the hall, his dad yelled, "While you're out there, get the paper." Lucy followed her husband into the kitchen while Lance got dressed. "What was that all about?" she asked. "I'm not sure. Lance and I had a long talk to each other the other night, and he told me some things that has me a bit worried. I'm not sure how to deal with it." "You want to tell me about it?" she asked, giving her husband the option of keeping menfolk conversation between them. He shook his head and said, "If it gets told, I think it's Lance that needs to do the telling." "Is this about what happened in Kentucky, or what happened last year?" Kenneth shrugged and said, "I really don't know, but what we talked about was. It may just be a 24-hour bug thing that just has some bad timing." Lucy shook her head and said, "You didn't hear his voice. See the look on his face earlier. It was like he was another person. Two, actually." Kendall nodded and asked, "Think he might be relapsing?" "I honestly don't know," she answered him. "He wasn't with us when he had this breakdown. We don't know what led up to it, and I don't think it's a good idea to ask his mother because she's likely to try and use it to get the courts to give him back to her." She heard the sound of the boy's bathroom door closing and then the shower running. Before Ken could say anything else, Dale came running into the house with a paper in his hand, his face full of excitement. "Guess what? There were 2 murders at the skating rink last night." His voice was just a bit too enthusiastic for Lucy's taste as he handed her the paper. Sure enough, the front page had a story about a double murder at the skating rink that Dale had got into a fight at yesterday. She frowned and looked at him and said, "Lance is taking a shower. If you need to use the bathroom, use mine and your dad's." "Nah," he announced. "I peed off the deck before I went to get the paper." Lucy just rolled her eyes at her son. Still Saturday. From the other rooms, Lance could hear his dad and stepmom talking. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but after last night's events, he found his body on high alert, even if his mind didn't know why. He shook his head as he tried to think of how to alleviate the fears without letting them know he had overheard them. That would just be more explanations that right now he didn't have the energy for. He appreciated his dad's discretion, and something told him that Dale's announcement about the skating rink was going to become important to him. Finishing up at the toilet, he went ahead and took a shower before heading back to his room. His body still felt crusty from all the sweating he did while he was asleep. Stepping under a cool water, he felt it wash away the last vestiges of not only his sleep, but of whatever it was that gave him the fever and the upset stomach. By the time he was done and dressed, Lucy was cooking breakfast, and Dow was parked off in front of the television with a bowl of Cocoa Puffs. Lance smiled at his little brother, whose eyes were glued to the secrets of ISIS, as he shoved chocolate cereal into his mouth without looking. With a nod to Andrea Thomas, he turned to where Lucy was kneading dough for biscuits. "Anything I can help with?" She shook her head and told him, "Not for me, but you may want to check with your dad. He went out to sharpen a saw before putting it away." Lance nodded and said, "I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't need a new chain. Mockeye and his murder on them. We must have had to stop 4 times to resharpen the saws yesterday." She nodded to him, and he headed out the front door. "Now you sound like your dad." "I'll take that as a compliment," he told her as he stepped out on the deck of their house 10 feet above the sandy ground below. It was a pain in the arse to climb that many stairs, but the house was protected from hurricane storm surge this way. He looked out over the rice fields towards the tree line along the riverbank and smiled. The Gulf sky was clear, but he could already feel both the heat and the humidity begin to climb. He knew they were likely to get a short summer squall around 3 or 4 in the afternoon that would only make the air even stickier. Below, he could hear his dad running the file across the teeth in the saw. 4 long strokes with the file, then a click and the chuck of him advancing the chain, and the process started over again. He found his dad in a cool shade under the house sharpening the big McCulloch with a 36-inch bar. A glass of iced tea sitting next to him on one side. "Need some help?" "You can take the poling," his dad said, taking a Winston out of his mouth, and with a nod, Lance grabbed the other chainsaw and 2 files and sat down across from his dad and began to sharpen the teeth on the chain. For long moments, the only sound they made was the rhythm of the files against the metal. Finally, his dad tapped the round file against the thick tread of his work boot and said, "How you feeling this morning?" Lance shrugged and said, "Fever seems to be gone, and the only thing my stomach feels right now is empty." Shaking his head, his dad smiled and said, "Teenage boys and their bottomless guts." Then his voice grew serious. "Are you sure this is just some short-lived bug, and not something like we were talking about the other day?" Lance took a deep breath and said, "I honestly don't know. Last night I dreamt of Great Uncle Ophir and his twin." "Ophir's twin died when she was a baby," his dad said. "That's what Papa told us, but I'm not so sure." "What makes you say that?" his dad asked. "The dream?" Lance nodded his head. "Yeah, I dreamt that she got turned into some kind of monster. Her father couldn't bring himself to kill his daughter, so he chained her in a coffin in the family mausoleum." "Sounds like an episode of Dark Shadows," his dad told him. "It does, doesn't it?" Lance said. After a long moment he said, "When I went into the McNaughton mausoleum to get Dow after the Gwyner took him, I saw a chained coffin in there. When I went back to check on it a couple of days later, the coffin, chains and all, was gone." "Why didn't you say something then?" his dad asked. "I was still processing what was happening to me then. I mentioned it to those government types who showed up. All would tell me is that it's been taken care of." "Could it be just a bad dream?" the elder McKnight asked. "I certainly hope so," Lance said. "I'd hate to think what that thing could do to people." "Lance," his dad warned. "Yes, sir?" "Don't go looking for things to fix. You pushed yourself into a breakdown doing that last year. Trust me, I've seen enough of the inside of hospitals of late. I'm not looking for people or situations to fix. I just want to be ready if the dream was more than just that." "What can you do about it?" his dad asked. Lance picked up a chainsaw, and so the blade was pointing up at an angle, and said, "Run it through with a chainsaw?" "Ken? Lance?" Lucy's voice called for them on the porch. "Breakfast is on." "Victuals are ready. Let's go and eat before Dale gets all." Lance smiled and said, "Last I saw him, he was loading up on sugary cereal and ISIS." His dad laughed and said, "Good taste in women, if not breakfast." Kendall unfolded himself from where he'd been sitting, his glass of tea in hand. Flicking his dead cigarette butt out in the yard, he said, "Let's go. Let's get it before he does." 5 minutes later, Lance was settling down to a breakfast of scrambled eggs, bacon, biscuits and gravy, and an iced tea and coffee. "What are your plans for the day?" Lucy asked. "I was supposed to meet some guys at the skating rink today, but based on that headline over there, I suspect that it's not going to happen." "Well, if you aren't doing anything, I've got a bushel of beans in the garden that needs to be picked and snapped them to get ready for caning." "I'll make you a deal," Lance offered. "I'll pick them if you snap them." She smiled at him and shook her head. "Oh no, we all snap beans." He shrugged and said, "Can't blame a guy for trying." "You'll appreciate those beans this winter," she said. "Don't you know snapping beans and shelling peas is every country kid's worst nightmare?" Lance asked her. "We can hardly call you a country kid. You live on a plantation that butts up next to a major city. 2, actually." Lance chuckled and said, "Yeah, but we're far enough out in the suburbs that it doesn't feel like it. And we've got a garden. A large one. That's country as far as I'm concerned, and I'm glad for it." "Boy," his dad said, shaking his head, "sometimes you say the damnedest things." "Just being honest, Dad. Somehow, I don't see you always being a country boy. You told me yourself you want to go into the Navy." "Sure, being a country boy won't stop that. President Carter was a country boy who went into the Navy," Lance replied. He didn't, however, tell his dad what he thought of Carter as a president. Instead, he said, "Well, if we're going to pick stuff up in the garden, I'm going to get it done before the sun gets unbearable," Lance told him. "That's the attitude," his dad replied. Several hours, a bushel of beans and 2 bushels of tomatoes later, Lance was sitting under the deck with his stepmom and Dale snapping the string in beans. Lance called himself looking south towards the old ruins of Chateau Le Maire and the McNaughton Mausoleum. His mind kept turning over the events of his dreams last night, as his nimble fingers snapped beans and pulled the strings out of them without thought. "Lance. Lance. Lance?" His stepmom finally prodded him back to here and now. "Huh? Your dad is calling you to the phone. He said it's Ted Galliard." "Oh." Lance smiled wanly and put down the bowl of beans. "I'm sorry." She just smiled and he exited the cool shadow under the house and climbed the stairs to the deck. His dad met him at the door and said, "Boy, you got cotton in your ears. I've been calling and calling you." "Sorry," he apologized. "I guess I was zoned out from snapping beans." His dad just laughed and said, "Just go on. Ted seems to be worried about something." Lance picked up the receiver and said, "This is Lance." "Who else would it be?" Ted asked. "It could be Dale or my stepmom," Lance countered. "And why would I call to talk to either of them?" "Your dad, maybe, since he's teaching me some new chords on the guitar. But when I call your house, I usually want to talk to you." "What's up, Ted?" Lance asked with a smile. "Look, I was supposed to meet Diane at the skating rink this evening, but it's closed right now. Somebody ripped the throats out of the owner and one of the workers last night. Please tell me you and Diane are not going to try and investigate that," Lance protested. "No," Ted asked, confused. "Do you think we should?" "No," Lance said a bit louder than he meant to. His dad turned away from the baseball game on the tube to see what was the matter. "No," he repeated in a softer tone. "What did you want me to do?" "Well, neither Diane nor I are supposed to be dating for another 2 years yet, but we both wanted to go to the movies. The only way we can both go together is to go as a group. I was wondering if maybe you might want to go and see Jaws too." His tone was nearly pleading. "What's showing?" 7:30? Ted asked. "Let me check." Lance put his hand over the mouthpiece of the phone and asked, "Dad, is it okay if I go to see the 7:30 showing of Jaws 2 tonight with Ted and Diane?" His dad turned to him, smiled and asked, "Still can't date, huh?" Lance nodded. "Something like that." His dad shrugged and asked, "You got those pole beans snapped yet?" "Mostly," Lance told him. "Get them snapped and help Lucy with the clean-up, and I'll carry you over to the theatre. What are you doing afterward?" "Maybe Pizza Hut across the street," he told his dad. He looked at the newspaper laying by the phone and checked the times. "Looks like the movie will be over about 9:30. We'll go over and get something to eat. I can ask Ted's dad if he can bring me home." His dad nodded and said, Sounds like a plan." "Thanks, Dad." He then turned to the phone and asked, "Can your dad bring me home?" "Let me check." The phone was silent for a few moments until Ted came back. "He says sure." See you about 7:30 then, Lance told him. Bye. Lance hung up on the phone and told his dad, Thanks, Dad. No problem, son. Lance checked his watch and realised it was nearly 5 in the afternoon. He hurried down the stairs and grabbed his bowl, sat down and began turning on the speed with the beans. His stepmom just shook her head, chuckling, and asked, What was that all about? Oh, I'm going to the movies with Ted and Diane tonight, he said. You chaperoning again? Nah, they can have the back row. I'll just sit a few rows away and give them some privacy, he told her. I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse, she asked. You going to expect Diane and Ted to do the same for you when you get a girlfriend? I think I'm going to hold off on the girlfriend thing for a while longer, he told her. Like I told Dad, I've got plans, and girlfriends are just a complication I can do without. That was the most sensible thing I'd ever heard a teenager say, she told him. But I suspect that, in not too distant future, you may be rethinking that. When you meet the right girl? He shrugged and winked at her. I'm less worried about meeting the right girl than meeting the wrong one. Still, yet Saturday. The thing had emptied one of the other coffins in the mausoleum for a place to rest, but there was no rest, and the universe took its payment for forcing its mind into the boys. It was its turn to dream dreams, and not its own. It dreamt of a life lived to near fullness, that then looped back on itself and joined with another self. The boy was no boy, but a man in a boy's body, reliving a childhood that wasn't the one he remembered. He had his own witcheries that made him nearly as dangerous as it was. Tossing in a fitful sleep, it dreamed of a life lived in mediocrity. As the day passed, it lived through one grey banal day after another. A fate it shuddered at for the sheer boredom. It dreamed of a fouled marriage and a mediocrum of success as a scholar. Then the life ended in a single explosion of fire and force, only to loop back into its youth. Now, at least, he had some witcheries to make interesting. Slowly, the thing came to realise that there was more to the usurper than just banality. He had witcheries of his own, and he was learning to use them. He had twice fought the thing that had nearly killed his brother, or fear, and had walked away. He had forged ties with her own great-grandmother and her great-uncles. He was clearly descended from a brother's line, but was marked far deeper by the Dubois blood than a McNaughton. Some part of the thing's mind balked at the name transformed from McNaughton to McKnight. The sound of the new name rang false in its mind and set its teeth on edge. It would not follow suit after it had killed the usurper and his family, but names were not really important to it anymore. It knew its name once had been Opal, but that meant nothing to it now. It existed to feed, to destroy, and to do its master's bidding. And when came evening, it climbed out of its borrowed coffin and stepped out into the warm autumn air. Some part of its mind registered the name of the owner of the coffin, Heroine McNaughton. It knew that the body that now turned to dust was an ancestress, but it cared not for the fact. The changes wrought on the land were nearly a century of progress made more sense now, thanks to its dreams of the usurper. They had traded dreams, and he had gained the knowledge it needed to navigate this frightening new world that had produced such banality. It moved through the thicket of trees that separated the old McNaughton mausoleum from a nearby park. Reaching its edge, it sat and watched as families packed up their belongings and headed home. Soon, the park was empty of all except a couple of young dark-skinned men bouncing a ball off the ground and then throwing it through a hoop on a pole. Their bodies were slick with sweat and exertion, and they were obviously enjoying their friendly rivalry and love of the game. The name of the game came to it from the usurper's dreams, basketball, and from the shadows of the trees it watched and practiced its own witcheries on the men. Slowly, and slipped its thoughts into theirs. They were brothers enjoying this park because one near their home, miles away from here in Spanish Fort, was an area marked by violence and vice. This game, at this park, was part of their brotherly routine, and they both took it very seriously. It started with anger. Anger was easy. Most people tripped over it constantly, making their lives chaotic and miserable. Next came frustration. It was too easy, and anger and frustration led to one another. I looked over at the men playing and could almost feel their friendly rivalry becoming something more intense as they strained against each other, trying to put the ball in the hoop. As the rivalry became more intense, the men became almost frantic as they bobbed and weaved around each other, one trying to move the ball towards the hoop, the other trying to stop it. One final push, and they felt something in their minds snap. The older brother, the one with the ball, spun in place and drove an elbow into the side of his brother's temple. There was just enough speed, just enough torque, that the strike shattered bone and severed blood vessels. The one struck spun to the ground, smashing his face against the hard surface. Pain, anger, and frustration became rage, and as he scrambled to his feet and tackled his brother, who was coming down from the jump that put the ball in a hoop, both men went smashing into the pole, supporting the goal. The sound of metal rang across the park as the older one hit his head on the pole, and sat and watched the two brothers as they struggled against each other, now both lost in red haze of fury that had settled over them. Punching and kicking, they rolled across the grass in the direction of the tree line, where it sat and waited in anticipation of a feast that was to follow. He had noted that the younger brother's eye had turned blood red where he had been hit in the temple. It smiled, understanding that meant that soon he'd be collapsing as blood filled his brain case. When the two brothers were just a yard from his tree line, it struck. Two preternaturally long arms stretched out, the rake-like fingers sank into their flesh, and in a flash it yanked the two brothers to her and smashed their heads together. Soon, the only sound coming from the park was the call of the night birds, and if one listened closely, the soft, sucking sounds of it feeding on their blood of the two brothers. By the time it was done with a ghastly meal, it felt that the usurper had moved. He was no longer encompassed with the thick stone walls of his strange house on stilts, but was now moving away to the north and west. It marvelled at how fast the mortals of this new century could move. The horseless carriage had changed the face of the world. It decided that this new era was going to make hunting fun. With a mind that, although determined, was easily distracted by the thoughts it had stolen from the usurper, it followed the trail that connected them like ribbons of blood. At least twice it became distracted by one encounter or another as it passed through the shadows by squeezing space and letting it spring back into place. Part of it, the part that was tracking the usurper, kept it on a general course towards the prey. That part would not let go of the anger and hatred of or fear taking its place as their father's chosen. Kept it focused on moving towards the usurper. It was only this focus that saved at least half a dozen young men and women from becoming a bloody feast for its appetite. It landed behind a large building that seemed to serve as a juncture of two lines of buildings connected at 90-degree angles. The term strip mall came to it from the usurper's memories. It could not tell what was meant by strip, but it knew what a mall was and a shop was. This place seemed to gather shops into one place. Blinking to the top of the building, it looked out at the city. Now lit in all of its glory, Gulf City was much larger than she remembered, even Mobile, or New Orleans had been. Impossibly tall buildings were cast against the skyline that drowned out the stars themselves in a wash of light. Whatever small part of opal remained inside the thing cowered back at how small it made it feel. Shaking its head free of such thoughts, it began pacing back and forth along the building's roof, considering how to get in. Beneath its feet, it sensed the whole room packed with fear and anticipation. In its mind's eye, it could see fleeting images of giant fish that was devouring people on a strange boat. Again, the images disturbed the thing. It made no sense. Were these people watching others being fed to a shark? Had they become even more depraved than it, who had slain its own mother? It had no idea how long it waited, but it waited, tied to the mind of the usurper. That mind was giving it focus, something to draw inexorably to a contest of wills between the two. And strangely, in a mass of fear and anticipation, the usurper's mind was once of calm and sometimes even amusement. It was as if he was immune to whatever was going on inside, and so it waited. It waited while the usurper left the building below and crossed the avenue to the building with a red sign, Pizza Hut. From the shadows atop of this building, it observed its prey. It was young, no older than its own twin, of fear, when it changed. He was thin, with blonde hair that was parted in the middle, and worn shoulder length. His eyes were the same magnotta blue, that it saw in her own mirror before the change, and his skin was fair. He was wearing a strange shirt with the sleeves cut off and hemmed at the upper arm. His trousers looked like denim, and he wore no hat. He seemed to be with two others, a boy and a girl, who were obviously courting. Perhaps as some sort of chaperone. In one of its more lucid moments, it decided that it could not fathom what that silly girl saw in a boy her own age. And if she were eligible to enter society, she should be set in her hat for an older man who could support her. I'd wondered if their blood would taste sweet and virginal, unlike that it devoured last night, or even earlier this evening. Finally, the usurper left the Pizza Hut with the other boy and an adult operating one of those strange horseless carriages that usurper knew as cars. To her surprise, the girl left with another man in another car and headed into a different direction. For a moment, part of it wanted to follow the girl, only the pull of the usurper held its attention long enough to keep it from following. Keeping its thoughts on the usurper, it began blinking and squeezing space between places to keep up, staying to the shadows, and watched as the car headed back towards Bon Travel. The usurper was heading home, smiling to itself. The thing blinked away the space until it was on the old road that led from the city onto the plantation. Sliding up into the shadows of the tree limbs that lined the side of the road, it waited for the horseless carriage to arrive near the drive to the strange house on stilts. Saturday night. All night long, Lance had felt as if he was being watched. Occasionally, he would get a flash of something reaching out to his mind as if it was double-checking to make sure he was there. He tried to shut off the contact the way Vasir had shown him, but it cut through his defences. It left him jumpy and on edge all night, and not very good company to his two friends. But of course, they really were more interested in each other's company than his. He was okay with that. And at dinner, it was a bit different. They were sort of forced to acknowledge him at the table. In a flash of insight, he realised that this was his own fault. It had been him that had pushed the two best friends to become more. It had mainly been a way of deflecting Diane's romantic interest in Lance by putting them where they rightfully belonged. But, as they say, no good deed goes unpunished. "So, how are you holding up?" Diane asked him as the waitress delivered the pizza. "Holding up?" Lance asked. "I've heard some interesting stories about that trip you took to Kentucky," she said. "I don't mean to pry, but this is the first chance we've had to talk to you since you got back." Lance shook his head and said, "We were attacked. Mr. Lee and Mr. Grant were killed. We tried to walk out of the mountains and met a group of kids whose parents were also killed. There was a fire, another attack, and one of those kids got killed." Strangely enough, it was Ted who caught Lance's tone and said, "No need to go any further." "But I want to know if it was a Gwyner," Diane protested. Lance looked at her and said, "Yeah, it was a Gwyner, and something else too." "What are the chances of you facing two Gwyners in a year?" Diane asked. Lance took a deep breath and said, "Something I don't want to think about." "Why?" Diane demanded. Ted looked nearly stricken. He'd been coming to Lance's house for picking since he got back from Kentucky and hadn't pressured Lance for any information about what happened. All he had to know was that his friend was hurting. He didn't have to talk about it. "Because it would mean that I'm a threat for people to be around," Lance told her flatly. "It means that just going out in public can get people around me hurt, and that's something I don't want to see. It's like hanging a pork chop around my neck and staking me out for bears. Anybody gets close to me might get mauled." "I'm sorry," she said, seemingly to finally get the point. Lance just nodded and took a piece of pizza for himself. Diane pressuring him was probably going to cause a row between the two, but that couldn't be helped. They were, after all, only 14. Trying to change the subject, Ted said, "You know, you did really good last night. You learned more in a year than I have in 3. He shook his head and said, "I just don't get your fascination with country songs that are older than we are." Lance smiled and said, "Thanks. I was raised on the stuff. I've been doing that with Dad since I was old enough to walk." "And you're just picking up a guitar?" He smiled and added, "Or as your dad says, a geet box?" Lance sighed and told him, "To be honest, it's only been the last year where a lot of things have clicked in my head. It's like something has flipped a switch." He had no desire to tell his friends the truth about who he is, or who he was, and how he came to be. It was more than just a little creepy, especially when Vasir encouraged him to explore the physicality of it with other kids his age. "You think you can find that switch in my head?" Ted said. "I mean, you're a star football player, a straight-A student, and now a pretty good guitarist. Want to start a band?" Lance asked, half kidding. "If we could agree on what to play for sure," Ted told him. "You like country, and I like rock. There's always southern rock. Admit it, you love playing Freebird with my dad." Ted nodded and said, "Yeah, and the Allman Brothers are pretty good too." Lance smiled and said, "See, we'll make a country fan of you yet." "Please don't," Diane said. "I like him just the way he is." Lance just nodded to her and said, "As you wish." Then, turning to Ted, he said, "The real trick to what you are asking for is focus. Learn to do things right in the first place, and do them the right way every time. Then it becomes habit." "You sound like my dad," Diane commented. "Okay, I'll shut up," Lance told him. He realised that, at 14, they just knew that they were smarter than adults around them, and that was a belief that they weren't going to get rid of until they themselves had children. "I didn't mean it in that way, Lance," Diane protested. "And I didn't take it that way, whatever that way is." "So, any word on Bobby and Jeff?" Diane asked. "Last I heard, Bobby, his mum and his sister are going to spend the summer in Michigan with her brother. Jeff has gone to live with his older brother in Bayou La Batre. His mother died 2 years ago." "Man, I can't imagine losing both my parents," Diane said. "How do you think the Howard kids feel?" he asked. "They lost both of their parents at the same time, and then their sister." "Lance," Ted said, his voice becoming serious, "I know you're beating yourself up about the girl. Don't. From what I've heard, you did everything in your power to protect everyone. You're not Steve Austin." "Can we not talk about it?" Lance asked. "Sure, pal," Ted told him, shooting a hard look to Diane. "I think I see my dad," Diane said, grabbing her last piece of pizza and biting into it before hugging both boys good night. "What was that all about?" Lance asked. "Diane feels like we've been letting our paranormal investigation slip since we started seeing each other," Ted answered. "Smooching getting in the way of ghost hunting?" Lance asked with a smile. Ted nodded and said, "Yeah, something like that. And she thinks you need a girlfriend." Lance held up his hand and told his friend, "No." "Why not?" "Several reasons, actually," Lance told him. "Such as?" Lance began ticking off the points on his fingers. "First, I've got too much on my plate as it is. Football, paranormal investigation, classwork, my chores, my family obligations, and playing the guitar. Secondly, I haven't met anyone I liked enough to call a girlfriend, and I'm not going to put someone on my arm just to have something there. Thirdly, and probably most importantly, there's much too much weird stuff in my life to expose someone to it." "You don't have a pork chop around your neck, Lance," Ted said. "You just had a run of bad luck." Lance shook his head and said, "No, other people have a run of bad luck around me, but it still applies. I don't want anyone else to get hurt. And so please, encourage Diane to drop the issue." "You know how Diane gets when she wants something," Ted said, "but I'll try." "That's all I can ask," Lance replied, looking down at his watch, and Ted's dad walked through the front door. "You boys about ready to go?" "Yes, sir," Lance told him. He looked at Ted and then nodded towards the pizza. "You want to take that home?" "Sure. Let me get a box." Lance stepped outside the restaurant to wait for his friend. Ted's dad followed him. "Did they behave themselves?" the man asked with a smile. "Ted was a perfect gentleman the whole night," Lance told him. "Ha! Would you tell me if he wasn't?" Lance chuckled and told the man. "Probably not. At least not unless it was something egregious." "Did a 14-year-old just use the word egregious to me?" Lance smiled and lied. "It was a vocabulary word last year." "At least someone is paying attention in class." "I wouldn't go that far," Lance told him. "There are a couple of squirrels outside Mrs. Watley's class that I'm on a first-name basis with." The older man laughed as Ted came out of the restaurant. He then asked, "You boys ready?" "Sure," Ted answered. "Ready as I'll ever be," Lance told him. The drive back to Bon Travail was mostly quiet. Lance was caught up in his own thoughts about the thing whose dreams he'd shared last night. He had no idea what Ted and his dad were thinking. As they pulled down the lane leading to both the main house as well as his own, Lance felt something stir in the night. It was evil, and he could sense that it wanted his blood. With a frown, he told Mr. Galliard, "If you don't mind, just drop me off at the end of the drive. If Branny hears the car, she'll start barking, and that'll wake up my brother Dale. And we'll never get him back to sleep if we do that." "Light sleeper?" Mr. Galliard asked. "More like sleepwalker," Lance told him. "We have to deadbolt the front door to keep him from going outside in the middle of the night, but if something disturbs his sleep, it can set off a nighttime adventure for all of us." "You sure?" Mr. Galliard asked. "I told your dad that I would bring you home." "I'm sure. It's only about a quarter mile, and the night's warm." The other man started to protest when Lance told him, "It's okay." He put his will behind the command and watched it settle over the man like a warm blanket. "Okay, but I want you to be careful," Mr. Galliard said. "I always am. Best to be safe, not sorry," Lance replied as the car pulled into the drive and then backed out to turn around on a lane. "There you go," Mr. Galliard told him. "I'll call your dad tomorrow." "Thanks," Lance told him, hopping out and hoping that he'd be able to explain it tomorrow. Last time he felt something like this was when the Gwyner yanking him through the bedroom window without ever touching him. There was another arcane out there, and it was not friendly. He watched the tower lights disappear down the road before turning back towards the house. If he could get to the woodpile, that was where he kept an axe ready. If not, then he'd have to make do, because something told him that he wasn't going to avoid whatever it was that was out there. Walking along the sand of the drive, he began expanding his senses. Concentrating hard, he shifted the shape of his eyes, multiplied the number of rods in them, and reshaped the cornea and the tapetum. As the colour drained from the world, his eyes picked up more ambient light, and he saw the land around him the way a cat does. Turning back to face the tree line and the road, he saw something slide down out of the trees and begin to stalk him. One moment, it appeared to be a gangly white creature with black eyes and bony arms that were too long. It had sickly white skin stretched across its gaunt body. The next instant, it was a girl from his dreams. She seemed to be doing something to the space between them and was closing fast in what appeared to be short blinks. He stopped and said, "You must be Opal." That stopped her. She tilted her head to the side. She hissed with a mouthful of sharp teeth.
"The usurper knows it."
"I know what was done to you," he said.
"What was done does not matter,"
the thing hissed. Lance noted that it did not try to confuse him with the image of the girl.
"What matters is what the Master wants."
"You mean Westhall?"
"The Lord Westhall,"
it protested. "Sorry, I'm an American. We don't recognize titles." He told it just to find out how it would react. It began to tremble in front of him. "What does Westhall want?"
"Master wants all of the Father's line wiped from the face of the earth."
Its voice became nearly petulant. "Why?" Lance asked.
"Because Captain McNaughton killed him." "It doesn't ask why. It only does as it's told,"
the thing hissed. Lance noticed that his arm started to grow in length. Its hands spread wide, and the fingers grew into something that looked like tines of a rake. "You are my great-grandfather's sister. I don't want to fight you," he said. "You are family."
"The only family is Master,"
it spat angrily.
"Not the usurper."
"Usurper? What have I taken of yours?" he demanded, and it looked around, waving its long black clawed hands to encompass the whole of Bontreval.
"This,"
it hissed.
"This is all should be mine, not yours."
"I don't want it," Lance told it. "The only thing that is mine is in the house behind me. If you want to go there, you have to go through me." It looked confused.
"Usurper talks too much,"
it hissed as it launched a rake-like arm at him from 20 feet away. Ducking and spinning inside to avoid the claws, Lance got in too close for it to bring them to bear. Hopefully, he kicked it dead in the chest with everything he had, making sure to keep his other heel flat on the ground. He was rewarded with a solid crunch as the thing was hurled down the drive and across the road. It lashed its overly long hands and arms out to its side and brought itself to a stop using her limbs and trunks of the trees.
It fights like its father.
Lance shook his head and said, "No, Captain McNaughton wouldn't kill you because you were blood of his blood. I don't care. What I care about is behind me. You are in front of me. I will kill you." The thing that had once been Opal McNaughton hissed incoherently, pulled its arms until they were only slightly out of proportion, and charged. Lance dodged the first wild swing, stepped in and delivered another powerful blow to its hip. It twisted in midair and lashed out with its other clawed hand, and he felt the black nails bite into his left side, his hip and forearm. They burned like fire and then became numb. He looked down in horror as the flesh where he had been hit became black and began to peel back and putrefy, revealing the muscle and bone beneath it. "Oh, hell no," he said, looking up as the thing bounced down the road, turning over and over like some animated tumbleweed. When it scrambled to recover from its kick, Lance looked down at the wound on his arm and hoped it was something that would heal. He worried because this thing was like the first Gwyner, part of his bloodline, and could therefore hurt him. He considered his options, and none of them were good. His best bet was to get a weapon to keep this thing at bay. Turning, he raced up the drive to where the axe lay against the woodpile. He could hear the thing closing the distance with him by squelching the space between them. It seemed to have to do this in jumps, so it couldn't be on top of him instantly, and that was good. He could smell its fetid breath on his neck as he reached with one hand for the axe and a piece of firewood with the other. He ducked and rolled backwards as the thing propelled itself over him and smashed into the woodpile. There was a horrific ruckus as the thing tumbled through the hardwood, scattering logs all up and under the house, some banging the metal building where his dad kept tools. That was going to wake up the whole entire house, and sure enough, as it picked itself up, the front deck lights went on. "What the hell is going on down there?" Brandy began barking and growling loudly. "For the love of God, Dad!" Lance screamed. "Stay in the house and keep Lucy and Dale with you." Of course, his dad wasn't going to listen. He saw him turn to someone in the house and say, "Get me the rifle." Lance watched the thing turn and look at his dad and gave him a horrible smile. It winked away and appeared halfway up the stairs leading to the deck. Lance launched himself through the air, aiming for the spot halfway between the thing and the front door. He had a theory about how the squinting worked. He'd prefer to gather more data, but he didn't have the luxury. All he could do was to scream and leap and hope he was right. And he was right enough. The thing came out of its blink right where he thought it would. He hit its shoulder first from the back as Brandy launched herself out of the door, teeth bared and aiming through the throat. The force of the two blows carried Lance, Brandy, and the emaciated creature high into the air and out over the yard. And for what seemed to be a long moment, the three bodies were suspended in mid-air. Then they began to fall from the good 20 foot up. Lance reached down and grabbed Brandy's collar and pulled the puppy to him as he twisted the monster under them. If he timed it right, he could land on it with the full force of their mass. Much to his horror, the thing winked away just before they hit the ground. Lance used his legs to absorb as much of the shock as he could and then released the dog as he tucked and rolled. It didn't come to a stop until he slammed head first into the side of the stairs leading up to the deck. Rolling away, holding his head and trying to clear his vision of stars, he heard the lever go back on his dad Henry. Then the 44-70 barked. His dad chambered another round and the Henry barked again. Lance staggered to his feet and looked across the yard where the thing was moving towards him, dragging one of its arms uselessly behind it. Next to him, Brandy growled low and tried to put herself between him and the thing. "Brandy, no! Guard Dale!" He barked at the dog, putting his will behind the command. The dog stopped dead in its track and bounded up the steps to protect the little boy. Bam! Clutch! Bam! Clutch! Bam! Clutch! Bam! The Henry barked again and again as the thing continued to advance on Lance. He could see huge holes blown through the dead white flesh as black ichor poured from its wounds. And it kept coming. Hefting the axe in his good hand, Lance stepped forward to meet it head on. His left arm and his right were both injured, and so they faced each other squared off. It wailed into the night, not bothering to squinch space, but instead charged him, waving and extending its good arm to take and try and rake him again. The blow went over his head and then twisted low as it snapped back to the thing, trying to rake Lance in. Staying low, Lance stepped in and hacked under its ribcage, embedding the axe deep inside its body. Dancing out of the way, he snatched the axe and stood to watch it try and turn toward him. It screamed at him again as its form began to wink back and forth from the thing to Opal to the thing. He growled at it. "Won't work. I don't give a damn if I kill the thing or if I kill Opal." "Family," it hissed. "You are not my family. Whatever you are, you ceased to be family when you murdered my mother," he growled, realizing it was using his own earlier argument against it. "Woman," it pleaded, thinking that Lance's hand would be stayed by its gender. Lance shook his head and growled. "Not as far as I can tell." He drew back the axe to see what the thing would do next, and it kept summoning the image of Opal, but slowly and surely, Opal was melding into the thing. Stepping forward to finally end it, he heard his father bark, "Lance, stay down!" The Henry barked several more times, and Lance watched as two 44-70 rounds slammed into its head and blew out the back of its skull. "Now, cut its head off!" his dad yelled. Lance looked back at him, holding the axe in his hand. "You'd think?" He stumbled forward and raised the axe. Much to his surprise, the thing was blinking at him. The black ichor on its face looked like tears pleading for mercy. Lance hesitated for just a second. Suddenly a sharp pain pierced his thigh, and he looked down to where its good hand was trying to yank him from his feet. He swung the axe with everything he had in his body. In a single blow, he severed the head from the thing's body. The white head rolled away and slowly began to change into that of a girl, Opal. Looking down at the body that held him by the leg, it too slowly became Opal again. Then the years seemed to pile up on the body, and it began to quickly decay until only dust remained to be stirred by the cool Gulf wind. For long moments, he stood there staring at the dust as it slowly rose into the air and spread itself across the fields of Bon Traval. He shook his head and wondered what was next. His life had been turned upside down since he woke up in that hospital room last year. He'd been attacked 3 times by creatures out of the most twisted nightmares he could dream. He had survived by the skin of his teeth all 3 times, saved only by his witcheries and high-caliber rifles. He looked around at the mess. The damage wasn't as bad as it could have been. There was a dent in the metal storage building and the firewood that had got scattered. It could have been far worse. He didn't know how long he'd stood there looking off into the distance when Brandy and Dale came up to him. His brother slipped his hand into his and asked, "You going to keep this up?" "Keep what up?" "Killing these things before they can get to the rest of us." "I'd like not to have to." "Me too," Dale said. "By the way, your eyes are freaking cool. How do you do that?" "Huh?" Lance asked. "Your eyes. They glow like cats and their shape is kind of funny. How do you do that?" Lance groaned and then remembered the changes he'd made to see better. "I don't know what you're talking about." He smiled as he turned to face his brother, his eyes looking normal. Dale just laughed and said, "Come on inside. I'm sure Mum wants to look at those cuts." Lance looked down at the dead flesh around the wound and shuddered. "Ugh, looks awful." Dale sniffed and said, "Smells worse. Now go and let Mum do her thing with the mercurochrome." Lance smiled at him and said, "I'm not sure I'd rather lose an arm." "Up to you," his brother said. "You're going to enjoy this, aren't you?" "Me?" Dale asked. "What do you think?" "Huh, I think you're going to enjoy this a little bit too much, Rabbit." Wow, absolutely awesome, jam-packed, intense thrill ride, fantastic characters, setting, the evil of that creature, I could sense it. Wonderful, wonderful writing, Wayne. Thank you so much for your penning that for me. I think this is going to be another channel favourite, Wayne. It's certainly becoming one of my favourite stories ever. As ever, guys and girls, I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I. Please do let us know down below though, in the comments, what you thought. Please do like and share, help build the channel and our community further. And of course, don't forget the hashtag TeamFEAR. If you yourself have a story, whether true or fictional, you'd like to share with us here on the show, you can do so by getting that over to me on my website, which is www.dmtforesterfear.com. Almost Friday, guys. One more day to go. And then a beautiful, beautiful weekend with family, friends, good food and good weather. And above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.